At 3:17 a.m., on the elevated concrete pad of Launch Complex 7 at the Sohae Satellite Launching Station on North Korea's northwestern coast, the final countdown sequence for a Hwasong-17 intercontinental ballistic missile reached its terminal phase. The missile had been on the pad for 11 days, its liquid fuel loaded 48 hours earlier in a process that had been tracked continuously by 3 separate American intelligence collection systems from the moment the first fuel tanker had driven through the facility's main gate. 11 days of photography, of signals intercepts, of acoustic monitoring, of the slow accumulation of evidence that this was not a test and not a demonstration and not the kind of launch that gets announced to the International Civil Aviation Organization with a flight corridor advisory. The trajectory analysis completed by Strategic Command's modeling systems at 2:44 a.m., 93 minutes before ignition, had produced a single, unambiguous answer. The Hwasong-17 on Pad 7 at Sohae, given its azimuth alignment and the performance parameters of the missile type, was aimed at Andersen Air Force Base on the island of Guam. 3,600 miles of Pacific Ocean between the launch pad and the target. A flight time, depending on the specific trajectory the guidance system was programmed to fly, of between 28 and 34 minutes. The home of the 36th Wing, the B-52H bombers of the 69th Bomb Squadron, the tanker fleet that sustained American air power across the Western Pacific, and approximately 7,000 American service members and their families. The decision chain moved with the speed that a 93-minute warning allowed. Unlike the compressed timelines of the tactical missile scenarios in the Middle East, where warning was measured in minutes, and the engagement authority was pre-delegated precisely because there was no time for anything else. The Hwasong-17's liquid fuel preparation cycle had provided Strategic Command with a planning window that was, by the standards of nuclear-adjacent crisis management, almost luxurious. 93 minutes to confirm the targeting assessment, to elevate the alert status of the missile defense architecture covering Guam, to position the additional intercept assets that the planning had identified as necessary for a high-confidence engagement against an ICBM-class threat, and to complete the notification of the National Command Authority that an adversary state was preparing to launch a ballistic missile at American sovereign territory. The decision that came back down the chain at 3:09 a.m., 8 minutes before ignition, confirmed through the secure command authority channels that authenticate orders of this significance, was not simply an authorization to intercept. It was the activation of an operational order that had existed in the classified planning files of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command for 6 years, updated and refined with each North Korean missile test, each intelligence collection cycle, each iteration of the wargaming that asked the question no one wanted to have to answer for real. What do you do when they actually shoot at Guam? The answer, in 6 years of planning, had evolved into something more comprehensive than an intercept. An intercept was the defensive component. The operational order addressed both components simultaneously. The intercept architecture would destroy the missile. The strike package would destroy the architecture that had launched it, and the command structure that had ordered the launch, and the missile production infrastructure that would otherwise allow the cycle to repeat. Not as retaliation, the word is imprecise for what the order described. As the termination of a threat that had, by the act of launching at American territory, forfeited any remaining ambiguity about its intentions. The Hwasong-17 ignited at 3:17 a.m. The liquid fuel engines, 4 RD-250 derivative motors, clustered at the missile's base, each producing thrust measured in hundreds of thousands of pounds, lit with the distinctive infrared signature that the Space Force constellation was already watching, having been tasked to the Sohae facility in continuous staring mode since 2:51 a.m. when the final launch preparations had begun. The missile cleared the launch pad at 3:17 a.m. and 11 seconds. The Space Force warning notification reached the USS Lake Erie, operating in the Philippine Sea 380 miles southeast of the Japanese coast at 3:17 a.m. and 23 seconds. 12 seconds from ignition to warning. The Lake Erie was a Ticonderoga-class Aegis cruiser carrying the SM-3 Block IIA interceptors that represented the primary engagement system for the exo-atmospheric mid-course phase of an ICBM-class threat. Her tactical action officer confirmed the launch tracking at 3:17 a.m. and 31 seconds. The Aegis system was already computing intercept geometry. The Hwasong-17 ascended through the atmosphere on the thrust of its first stage engines, accelerating through the sound barrier at 3:18 a.m. and through Mach 5 at 3:19 a.m., shedding its first stage at 3:20 a.m. as it entered the upper atmosphere on a trajectory that the Space Force sensors were characterizing with the precision that a sustained tracking campaign provides. The missile's azimuth, its velocity vector, its apogee estimate, all of it flowing into the targeting computers aboard the Lake Erie, and, through the theater missile defense data links, into the systems of the 3 additional surface combatants that had been repositioned over the preceding 6 hours into a defensive formation specifically configured for this engagement geometry. The USS John Finn and USS Fitzgerald were positioned south of Japan. The USS Curtis Wilbur had been repositioned to a point 200 miles east of the anticipated boost phase trajectory, giving it an advantageous engagement angle for the mid-course phase. Each ship had SM-3 Block IIA interceptors committed to the engagement. The architecture was redundant by design. If the Lake Erie's first interceptor missed, there were others. If the Lake Erie was somehow unable to fire, there were other shooters. The engagement had been designed to succeed. The SM-3 Block IIA is not a small weapon. It is 67 inches in diameter, 18 feet long, and carries a kinetic kill vehicle, not a warhead in the conventional sense, but a precision-guided mass of metal that destroys its target through the physics of a direct body-to-body collision at a combined closing velocity that exceeds 5 miles per second. At those closing velocities, the kinetic energy of the collision is equivalent to a substantial explosive charge. There is no warhead because there does not need to be one. The physics of the intercept geometry are sufficient. The kill vehicle steers itself to a direct hit using a combination of infrared seeker and command uplink, adjusting its trajectory in the terminal phase with cold gas thrusters that can alter its course by fractions of a degree, which at the engagement ranges involved translates into hundreds of meters of position adjustment. The Lake Erie fired her first SM-3 Block IIA at 3:28 a.m., 11 minutes after the Hwasong-17's ignition, approximately halfway through the missile's boost and mid-course phase. The interceptor's booster stack drove it upward through the atmosphere and into the exo-atmospheric environment above the Kármán line, where the kill vehicle separated and began its terminal approach to the Hwasong-17's projected intercept point. The Hwasong-17 was at this moment at an altitude of approximately 500 miles above the Earth's surface, moving at a velocity that the targeting computers expressed in kilometers per second, crossing over the void of space between the Korean Peninsula and the Pacific, on a trajectory that was, absent the intercept, going to place a thermonuclear-capable warhead over the Western Pacific within 22 minutes. The USS Curtis Wilbur fired a second SM-3 Block IIA at 3:29 a.m. and 40 seconds, a shoot-look-shoot protocol that committed the second interceptor before the outcome of the first was confirmed, providing a near-simultaneous second chance in the event of a miss. The protocol was standard for an engagement of this significance. The first SM-3 Block IIA kill vehicle achieved intercept at 3:31 a.m. and 7 seconds, at an altitude of 512 miles above the Pacific Ocean, approximately 400 miles east of the Japanese coast. The closing velocity was 9.4 kilometers per second. The Hwasong-17's re-entry vehicle, the section of the missile that carries the warhead payload and is designed to survive atmospheric re-entry, was destroyed. Destroyed is the precise word. The kinetic energy of the collision at 9.4 kilometers per second converted the re-entry vehicle from a coherent object into a cloud of rapidly dispersing fragments, some of which would re-enter the atmosphere over the coming days as inert metal debris, none of which retained the structural integrity to deliver any payload to any target. The second SM-3 from the Curtis Wilbur, arriving at the intercept point 12 seconds later, found only the debris field from the first intercept and transited through it without engagement. The Space Force infrared constellation confirmed the intercept at 3:31 a.m. and 9 seconds, 2 seconds after the kill vehicle's thermal signature changed from a tracking return to the dispersed bloom of a fragmentation event. At Strategic Command's primary operations center, the duty officer logged the intercept confirmation at 3:31 a.m. and 22 seconds and immediately passed the confirmation upward through the chain. The National Command Authority received the confirmation at 3:31 a.m. and 38 seconds, 16 seconds from intercept to presidential notification. The Hwasong-17 that had been aimed at Guam no longer existed as a functional weapon. The 7,000 Americans at Andersen Air Force Base and the civilian population of Guam were safe. The question that now occupied the chain of command was not whether to respond. The operational order that had been activated at 3:09 a.m. had answered that question. The question was whether the intercept had changed any of the parameters. It had not. The launch of a ballistic missile at American sovereign territory was the triggering condition. The intercept of that missile was the defensive component of the response. The offensive component was already in motion. The strike package for the operational order had been airborne since 2:51 a.m., 26 minutes before the Hwasong-17 ignited, launched during the window when the intelligence assessment had confirmed the launch was imminent, and the pre-delegated authority allowed the aircraft to be positioned without waiting for the final confirmation of a hostile act. 38 F-35A Lightning II fighters from Misawa Air Base and Kadena Air Base, operating in a coordinated formation that had transited the Korean Peninsula's western approaches at low altitude under the cover of the Growler jamming package that had been active since 2:48 a.m. 4 B-1B, Lancer bombers that had departed Andersen Air Force Base, the very base the Hwasong-17 had been aimed at 1:30 a.m. on a flight profile that had placed them in a holding orbit over the Philippine Sea, their weapons bays loaded with JASSMER cruise missiles assigned to the hardened infrastructure of the Korean People's Army Strategic Force. 2 B-2A Spirit stealth bombers, airborne from Whiteman Air Force Base since the previous afternoon, that had been transiting the Pacific for 14 hours and were, at 3:17 a.m., 230 miles southwest of the Korean Peninsula on their attack run. The EA-18G Growlers had been the first element to cross into North Korean airspace at 2:48 a.m., 19 minutes before the Hwasong-17 launched. Their jamming suite was configured for the specific radar and communications frequencies of the Korean People's Army Air and Anti-Air Forces Integrated Air Defense Network, the S-band and C-band acquisition radars, the fire control frequencies of the KN-06 long-range surface-to-air missile systems, the VHF communications nets that connected the forward air defense units to the Central Air Defense Command in Pyongyang. The North Korean Air Defense Network was not the same architecture it had been 5 years earlier. The KPN had made substantial investments in air defense capability, and the integrated picture it could present at full operational capability was a serious threat to conventional, non-stealthy aircraft. Under the Growler jamming envelope, it was an architecture fighting blind. The radar operators could see interference on their scopes. They could not see the aircraft that the interference was concealing. HARM missiles addressed the surviving radar emitters at 3:22 a.m., 5 minutes after the Hwasong-17's launch, while the missile was still climbing through the atmosphere. 6 KN-06 fire control radars, and 4 long-range acquisition radars were rendered inoperable between 3:22 a.m. and 3:24 a.m. The 2 that attempted to burn through the Growler jamming envelope by switching to backup frequencies found that the backup frequencies had also been characterized and were also jammed. They transmitted for 11 seconds before the HARM missiles found them. The primary target set for the offensive component was the Korean People's Army's Strategic Forces Command and Launch Infrastructure. Specifically, the Sohae satellite launching station from which the Hwasong-17 had just launched, the Missile General Bureau headquarters complex near Pyongyang that coordinated the strategic missile program, the liquid fuel production and storage facilities that sustain the Hwasong-series missile fleet, the 3 additional launch complexes that Space Force imagery had confirmed as in various states of readiness, and the hardened underground facility in the mountains north of Pyongyang that served as the Strategic Force's alternate command node, the bunker from which the order to fire the Hwasong-17 had been transmitted at 3:09 a.m., 8 minutes before ignition. The B-2s handled the hardened targets. Their GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators were assigned to the alternate command bunker, assessed through seismic analysis and signals intelligence, as buried at a depth that conventional bombs could not reliably defeat, and to the hardened missile assembly facility at Sohae that had been built into the hillside adjacent to the launch complex, in a construction effort that had taken 4 years and produced a facility designed, like Fordow, to survive conventional attack. The first B-2 reached its weapons release point at 3:35 a.m. The GBU-57, assigned to the alternate command bunker, impacted at 3:36 a.m. The seismic signature, 2.6 magnitude, registered on monitoring networks in South Korea and Japan, was consistent with the weapon reaching its design penetration depth before detonation. The bunker was assessed as rendered inoperable. The F-35A package addressed the launch complexes and the mobile transporter erector launcher vehicles that had not been expended in the Hwasong-17 launch. Space Force tracking had maintained continuous coverage of all known TEL vehicles in the Strategic Force inventory, their positions updated every 3 minutes through the engagement. 14 TEL vehicles at 5 locations were assigned to F-35A sub-packages. The F-35 is used GBU-39 small diameter bombs and GBU-31 JDAMs against the stationary vehicles and the fixed infrastructure of the launch complexes. The Sohae pad from which the Hwasong-17 had launched was struck at 3:39 a.m. The launch infrastructure, the service tower, the flame deflector, the propellant loading systems, the ground support equipment was comprehensively destroyed. The pad itself, the concrete and steel structure that represented years of construction effort, was rendered inoperable by 3 GBU-31 impacts that the post-strike imagery showed had collapsed the pad's structural integrity. The B-1B Lancers addressed the liquid fuel infrastructure. The Hwasong-17 series missiles require a specific combination of nitrogen tetroxide and unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, fuels that are highly toxic, highly reactive, and that cannot be improvised or substituted. The production and storage facilities for these propellants were concentrated at 3 locations that had been identified through a combination of signals intelligence and the chemical spectral signatures that the propellants produce under certain atmospheric conditions. Signatures detectable from orbit by sensors that had been specifically tasked to this collection problem for 14 months. 64 JASSM-ER cruise missiles from the 4 B-1Bs arrived at the 3 propellant infrastructure sites between 3:41 a.m. and 3:48 a.m. The storage tanks at all 3 sites were struck. The resulting fires burned for an estimated 11 hours. The production equipment was assessed as non-recoverable without reconstruction programs measured in years. The Missile General Bureau headquarters complex near Pyongyang was addressed by the second B-2 at 3:44 a.m. B-2 GBU-57s assigned to the complex's hardened command structure. The seismic signatures registered 2.4 and 2.8 magnitude on the South Korean monitoring network. The complex, which had coordinated the North Korean strategic missile program for 20 years, and from which the operational planning for the Hwasong-17 Guam strike had originated, was assessed as rendered inoperable. At 4:02 a.m., the strike package completed its weapons employment and began egressing south over the Yellow Sea. No American aircraft had been engaged. No American aircraft had been damaged. The North Korean Air Defense Network, operating blind under the Growler jamming envelope and with its fire control radars destroyed by harm, had fired 3 salvos of unguided anti-aircraft artillery in the general direction of the acoustic signatures of the B-1B engines, the only targeting information it had available. None of the rounds came near any aircraft. The post-strike assessment, completed at 6:47 a.m., characterized the results across the strategic force target set. The alternate command bunker, rendered inoperable. The Missile General Bureau headquarters, rendered inoperable. The Sohae launch infrastructure, comprehensively destroyed. 14 TEL vehicles, confirmed as total losses of asset. 3 propellant production and storage sites, non-recoverable structural damage, fires ongoing. 3 additional launch complexes, launch infrastructure destroyed, varying degrees of damage to support facilities. The Korean People's Army Strategic Force retained missile inventory, weapons stored in dispersed underground facilities that had not been the primary target of this operation's first strike package. What it no longer retained was the command architecture that directed the force, the launch infrastructure at its primary facility, the fuel that sustained the Hwasong-series fleet, and the mobile launcher vehicles that gave the force its operational reach. At Andersen Air Force Base on Guam, the base commander received the intercept confirmation at 3:32 a.m. and the all-clear notification at 4:15 a.m., when the post-strike assessment had reached sufficient confidence to confirm that no additional launches were imminent. The base had been at maximum alert status since 2:55 a.m. Service members had been directed to hardened shelters. The B-52s of the 69th Bomb Squadron, whose crews had been at cockpit readiness since 3 a.m., were stood down at 4:18 a.m. On the flight line, in the hardened aircraft shelters, the bombers sat in the pre-dawn darkness of a Pacific island that had, for 38 minutes, been the designated target of an intercontinental ballistic missile. The island was intact. The base was operational. The people were unharmed. The missile that had been aimed at them was a cloud of metal fragments descending slowly through the upper atmosphere, 500 miles above the ocean, on their way to burning up on re-entry. The facility that had built the program behind it was burning on the ground in North Korea. The command structure that had ordered the launch was buried under 280 feet of collapsed granite. The Pacific was quiet. The threat that had prompted 7,000 Americans to sit in shelters at 4 in the morning had consumed itself in the act of being launched, intercepted, and comprehensively answered. There would be assessments and deliberations and diplomatic consequences that would occupy the next months and years. At 4:18 a.m. on this particular morning, the only thing that mattered was simpler than any of that. The missile had not reached Guam. Everything else was tomorrow's problem. In the architecture of deterrence, the most important message is the one that arrives before the next launch decision is made.